Good evening and welcome to the first program in the Massachusetts Historical Society's series, Disability in the American Past. My name is Gavin Cleespies and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. So we're pleased to welcome you to the first program in our Disability in the American Past series. The complete series includes 4 panel discussions, 3 seminars, a film screening, and a K-12 educator workshop. In planning the series, we worked with a number of scholars and activists over about 10 months. We appreciate their help, and we also very much appreciate the support of our co-sponsoring organizations. You can learn more about this series at masshist.org/disability. Considering the large size of our audience today, I want to take a moment to introduce the Massachusetts Historical Society. We are the first historical society in America, dating back to 1791. We are an independent nonprofit organization that maintains a research library with close to 14 million pages of correspondence, diaries, and documents. We hold the papers of 3 US presidents, as well as mothers, inventors, preachers, and protesters. We make all of this material available to researchers for free and maintain an active schedule of programs and seminars throughout the year. We are able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. We hope that you'll return for future events in this series, or we'll explore our collections. Of course, if you enjoy our programs, we hope you will consider supporting our work by becoming a member. This evening, we are joined by 3 panelists and a moderator who will help us kick off the series with an introduction to disability history. All of the people appearing today have extensive credentials, but in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce them very briefly. Our moderator this evening is Professor Naomi Rogers from the Yale School of Medicine. She is a professor of the history of medicine, and her research interests include gender and health, disease and public health, disability, medicine, and film, and alternative medicine. She received her undergraduate degree from Melbourne University and her MA and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She is joined by Professor Rabia from Stanford Law School. Professor Beth is a legal historian whose scholarship focuses on disability and citizenship. Her research ranges from cultural analysis of disability in media to contemporary issues facing voters with disability, to the historical treatment of disabled Americans. She attended Harvard College for her undergraduate degree and then went on to earn her MA, JD, and PhD from the University of Michigan. The discussion also includes Professor Beth from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Linker teaches in the Department of History and Sociology of Science. Her research and teaching interests include the history of science, medicine, disability, health policy, and gender. Following a career as a physical therapist, she returned to school to earn a master's degree in the interdisciplinary programs in health and humanities at Michigan State University, and then her master's and doctorate from Yale University. Our final panelist is Professor Kim Nielsen, who teaches disabilities, history, and women and gender studies at the University of Toledo. Her scholarship has centered on historical debates about who is fit to participate in civic life, using gender, disability, and changing notions of competency as her tools of analysis. She attended Macalester College as an undergraduate and earned her master's and PhD from the University of Iowa. Finally, I would like to thank our ASL interpreter who's joining us from Partners Interpreting. So without further ado, I want to welcome Naomi Rogers to begin acting as the moderator.
Thank you so much, Gavin. And I want to welcome everybody to this panel, an introduction to disability history, which is part of a month-long series of events organized by Massachusetts Historical Society. And I and the rest of the panelists are delighted to be able to sort of jump into this session and introduce the field of disability history, talk a bit about some of the major research areas, especially around activism, material culture, medical history, technology, and citizenship, and also discuss a little about both the new emerging scholarship in the field, and also a bit about how we as scholars fit into this field as well. So I want to begin the panel discussion And let me say, first of all, that we don't have a particular order, so it's absolutely fine for whoever wants to jump in first, by asking our panelists to tell us all a bit about disability history and disability studies, and how would you characterize the place of disability history in the academy and in the wider public sphere? Give them a chance to decide who's going to jump in first. All right, I can jump you. Kim, let's begin with you.
Thank you for jumping me. Just a little bit of an audio description to those of you who are out there. Thank you for coming. I'm a white woman, shoulder length, brown hair, mid 50s, and am sitting next to a window. I think, well, I'm a little biased, but I think disability history is one of the most fascinating things going on in the world right now. It's world of academia and the larger world as well. There's a lot of public interest. There's a lot of student interest. At the same time, there's not a lot of knowledge. So all of us are needed very much. And those of you out there should feel free to continue to develop the field. I think the field's asking big questions that are very exciting. You know, at the same time, it's hard to get jobs in academia. And that is the reality for disability history as well. But it is an exciting place to be.
Rabia, you want to jump in as well?
Sure. I second the thanks to everyone who organized this panel and to the folks that are here with us. And I also want to second what Kim said in terms of both the excitement of disability history that, to paraphrase a great disability historian from Iowa, Doug Baton, disability history is everywhere. You just have to look. But it's hard because there haven't been a lot of folks that have been doing the looking. And often you have to be able to know what you're looking for. I've been really gratified to have people like Kim who have been mentors and people that I can look for. When I first started graduate school, I thought I was going to be someone who was going to do things like the history of psychiatry. So thinking about how psychiatrists have defined people in history and then been really intimately involved in creating places like prisons, but then also creating places like asylum. So both to harm and to heal people sort of ostensibly at the same time. But then I realized that I wanted to be more involved in the thinking about the people who have been defined as opposed to the ones who have been doing the defining. And that is a place in which there is less scholarship and then also less people to look to. But I'm lucky to be part of this panel for folks who have been doing a lot of that looking.
Beth, you want to jump in as well?
Sure, thanks Naomi, and it's wonderful to be on this panel with Kim and Rabia, and thank you Massachusetts Historical Society. I am sitting in my basement in my house, which had to become my office during the pandemic. So I am sitting in my basement with like clutter in the background. I'm a white woman with black framed glasses and long unruly hair, also because of the pandemic. So disability studies, I think Naomi, you asked disability history, disability studies, their place in the academy. It is, first of all, there's a lot of good work on disability studies and disability history. I think it's very difficult in the academy to get the same traction as some other studies that are out there. So women's studies and sexuality studies, I think, has more visibility than disability studies. And so what I find, so I think that there's obviously important work to be done. I think the greatest frustration right now is finding institutional support for disability studies, and the university has been slow on the uptake. And maybe we'll also get into a conversation about how the university, by virtue of being this place of higher education, wants to deny the existence of disability in a way, especially I think among faculty. They're getting maybe a little better with students. It depends on the institution. So, I mean, but that gets us to the now, right? So what does the history, and we'll get to maybe some conversations about how history and disability studies, which disability history is a part of, could maybe help inform us in making some changes to the now.
Oh, that's a great segue, actually. I want to talk some about disability history itself. And I thought that maybe a jumping off point would be to ask each of you how you got involved in this field. Rabia, you've already given us a sense, but let me follow up from what you said. Tell us a bit about how you began to seek out the voices and experiences of the inmates / patients as you were looking in asylums, prisons, and so on.
Well, so I didn't do a description of myself beforehand. So I am a Black woman in my 40s. I have short curly hair. I have a visual background of the Golden Gate Bridge behind me. So you don't see my brother's bedroom, where I have locked the door against my 4-year-old and 2-year-old nephews that wanted to be part of this webinar. So in terms of finding the voices in the lives of the people that I was interested in tracking, right? So one of the difficulties here, I think that we're definitely going to talk about, is that it's a lot easier to find the voices of the professionals than it is to find the voices of the people that are being treated and affected by the professionals. So initially I started to do work on things like the insanity defense, trying to see where the law has really spoken to think about and deem people to be sort of mentally incompetent in particular ways. And there are books in that vein I have published in that area, but then I wanted to do stuff that was more everyday, which was a lot more challenging. So I'm working on a book having to do with thinking about voting for people with mental disability over the long 19th century. So that 1819, hello, sweetie. I didn't lock the door well enough, sorry. So from 1820 to 1920. And a lot of this is looking at that everydayness, where the majority of states disenfranchise people based on mental status, and we still have those provisions. And there was this idea that you knew it when you saw it, that you knew the people that were supposed to be disenfranchised. But if you look at, say, transcripts of hearings on contested elections, you saw a community in which folks with mental disabilities were just neighbors and friends and husbands, and they went to the polls with everyone else. It's hard to find those spaces, and the sources are heavily mediated because they are sort of these transcripts, but they are there, right? If we sort of do that digging, which I know some of the rest of us have done. I mean, say, to throw it to Kim, for example.
I don't have anyone in my room with me as adorable. I
do, if you want him.
I'm trained as a historian of women in politics, and that is really where I thought I would spend my entire career. Through some just accidents of the archives, I began thinking about Helen Keller as a political figure. And I really, at that point in my life, and as an academic, I would have said I have no experience or interest in disability whatsoever. I soon discovered, of course, that I was completely wrong. And disability was everywhere, both in my life and in my scholarship. I became really interested in Keller because I discovered I knew nothing about her, and she had this rich, rich, rich political life that had just been erased. And I was captivated by that erasure and why that happened and what it was about disability and gender that caused that erasure and allowed it to happen for decades. So I started working on Keller as a political figure, and then I know that it was this conversion, but I think, when I was in graduate school, I did the thing where I complained about everything I read, that they weren't doing stuff well enough, and thinking about bodies and race and class and sexuality all simultaneous and a bunch of other stuff. And once I began to think about disability, both as an analytic and a topic, I began to be able to at least think about doing those complex analyses better than I could in the past. And so I found it a really useful tool. And then here I am.
Beth, you want to jump in?
So how did I come to disability history? Well, it's already been revealed that I had a clinical background that pertained to disability, but that I don't think that necessarily makes one, a disability historian. And I think what's interesting about the question, we can ask the question of any kind of field of study, right? And I think in disability history, we get the question perhaps maybe a little bit more, or there's more curiosity behind it. And in my answer to that, I kind of feel like, well, why wouldn't you study disability? It's a universal experience. It's like, I think it's easier to say, I used to say, so I came in as a historian of medicine, which Naomi knows very well since I was a student of Naomi's and the people at Yale, the good folks at Yale. And a medical historian, you get the people who say, well, why would you want to study medicine? We know so much better now than then, like what do you have to learn, right? And you get those people. But by and large, I thought I wanted to do medical history because it was such a universal experience, health and illness. But by extension, so is disability. So that is one of the reasons. And I think it helps us understand whatever history, whether it's US history or another region of the world. I think it makes us understand that history is so much better. So I think it's an essential way to understand the past is by looking at disability history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And actually, I want to answer my own question as well. So I was trained as a historian of public health and disease, and I'm still a historian of public health and disease. And the disease that I sort of picked as my initial dissertation work, which has continued as a major theme throughout my scholarship, was the history of polio. And I'm admitting to all of you here that when I first began writing about polio, I thought of it as a public health problem. I did not think about the people who were getting polio. I thought about the doctors and the public health officials and the politicians and how they were dealing with polio as an epidemic. And when I look at the first book that I wrote, which is about a particular epidemic, I'm actually shocked, or maybe I shouldn't be shocked, about how you would never really know that the survivors and the patients that I'm talking about were disabled, right? I just don't talk about that. And I feel that tells you a lot about that even though disability is everywhere, in a way you want scholars and everyone to be able to look for it, right? If it's everywhere, it can be seen as invisible. And it certainly was true to me as a young scholar. But then over time, I became more and more interested in the impact of the disease and other conditions on individual people. How did they experience and what difference did that make? And I ended up writing a book on the history of clinical care, about a nurse who challenged American doctors to rethink how to care for patients. So that was all about pain and disability. I mean, that was the whole issue. She was completely uninterested in how could you prevent it. That wasn't something that she felt was relevant to dealing with patients. But while I was doing this, and some of this was somewhat well-trod ground, I want to admit that, absolutely. So for example, Franklin Roosevelt, who was the first sort of famous American to get polio, to talk about having polio, and then to lie about having supposedly conquered polio, which he did not, but he felt, and his advisors did, and I think they were all right, that if he had actually admitted that his legs were never able to walk again without braces, he used his sons actually to sort of like swing himself when he had to pretend to walk, that he never would have been elected president. But I did realize that this was sort of familiar territory for many people around this. And so when I was doing a little bit of research in the Roosevelt papers in Hyde Park and elsewhere, I looked at the Warm Springs Health Resort rehab center that he bought and set up in this small town, where pretty much around Mineral Springs, known as the Warm Springs, in Georgia, and which became a major center for many people who wanted to have their spouses or children or whatever go to this center, hoping that it would do for them what it had supposedly done for Roosevelt, right? Have cured him. And in looking at that, I began to ask very different questions that I think hadn't been asked before. So just to finish this quickly, one of them was, why was Warm Springs white? Now, when I say white, in fact, there were lots and lots of African Americans at Warm Springs. They worked in the kitchen. They worked as janitors. They worked as gardeners and landsmen, but they were not ever hired as staff, as professionals, or ever admitted as patients. And it seemed to me that that was quite an interesting issue that hadn't been talked about before. So I did write about that as well. So I guess I want to move a little bit to talk, to have us all sort of reflect on what differences have we as historians seen about policies and experiences regarding disability in the last, say, 30 or 40 years. In what way is disability a different kind of concept today than it might have been in 1950 or 1970? So I'd be interested to hear what people have to say about that. And of course, the role of the Americans with Disability Act. So Rabia, let's start with you.
Well, I haven't been a scholar or professor for that time period entirely, so I can't say in terms of first people accounts. We certainly have a shift in the law in terms of having an anti-discrimination sort of law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the last of what we may think of as sort of a series of like civil rights sort of bills. That people have talked about how maybe the ADA has not been as metabolized sort of by the public and the culture as things such as the Civil Rights Act, or thinking about race discrimination, or even say the failed ERA, right, with respect to thinking about gender and sex discrimination. And I think people know more about things like Title IX, right, sort of having to do with sex discrimination than with the ADA. it has, I mean, to go back to this invisibility issue, it's changed our landscape, certainly, and it's changed what people have been able to access, that we have things like curb cuts and we have lifts and public transportation, things like that, that we didn't have before. But unfortunately, the changes in getting sort of more sort of disabled folks in employment, getting more folks in places of power, that hasn't happened as much as we would like. And there has been sort of certainly scholarship in terms of thinking about a series of different types of disability revolutions that have pushed us forward. So we can talk about, so I'm going to throw it to Beth, right, in terms of thinking about, say, disabled veteran politics, which has been really important, or thinking about the parents of disabled kids in the 1970s. And then we also have an ADA generation now, so folks who have grown up with the ADA that are now my students that really don't know anything different. And then we have the disability rights movement, sort of quote unquote itself, right, which were the folks that got us things like the ADA. People, so to speak of polio, it's a lot of those folks who are leaders or people that had contracted polio. So just a shout out for a film, for instance, like Crip Camp, that you can see on Netflix, that's about a decent amount of those folks. I think with respect to the academy, though, we haven't had protests as directed towards the academy itself. I think that's sort of given us the foothold that other areas have. So for instance, we've had these series of, say, 50th anniversaries of programs in Afghan studies. So these were created out of protest. They were not created because universities recognize the necessity of studying race, right? So their hand was forced. And a lot of that also happened with respect to women's studies, and then that expanded out to thinking about sort of gender and sexuality studies. But we don't really have the same sort of thing happening with respect to disability studies.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, Kim, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll take us in a different direction. I really agree with everything Rabia said, and give a shout out to Rabia there. I think some of the changes that I see that are really important are the expansion of what we talk about. And when we talk about disability and disability activism and disability history, and the movement itself has begun to think much more seriously about intellectual disabilities, cognitive disabilities, neurodiversity, intersection of multiple disabilities. And, I think that's an exciting place, but something that is not yet resolved. I think the movement continues to struggle with its own ableism in that regard. I think another fascinating thing to me is changing understandings of stigma. I'll sort of stick my leg out here and say, I think that the stigma around disability has changed dramatically in the last 30, 40 years, and it has diminished. It is, however, still really powerful. And we need to understand that better. I think also as people age and aging, we're beginning to think more about the relationship between disability and aging and the way that all of us age and change.
Just to jump in and say, when Kim says people, she actually means the baby boomers, as some of us are aging and there's more of us. We're ever more conscious about the kinds of policies and support that don't exist in order to be able to respond to that. But no, absolutely. Yeah. Beth.
Yeah, I think, similar to what I agree with what Kim said, and that there is like the tent of disability and who is disabled, and in a public conversation about who is disabled is expanding. So compared to 40 years ago, I think you might have your poster children, and it was usually probably a visible physical disability. And I think that that is changing. And I think that there is also, and there has always been, but I think it's even more a reckoning with how do we have disability pride, right? I think that that is still in the works. And there is, yes, this kind of, what do we do with, so Rabia brought up Crip Camp, and that is a wonderful film and very educational. But you have, it excludes people with intellectual disability, people with what one would call severe disability who need caregivers, and what do we do with those kind of stories? So I think it just shows the complexity of it. And then you add in Naomi and Kim, aging to that, which I still am not sure in disability history if we've done enough service to that itself. We always point to it as, we'll all be disabled at some point, right? And that assumes a kind of narrative that everybody has this nice, neat, tidy life, where in the end of the life that you will get old enough you will actually be healthy enough to grow old, and also you will have some kind of disability. But I think it's even more fluid and porous than that. But those are some of my thoughts about like what's changed in the last. And I think the ADA, it was really specific about environmental physical barriers, and it didn't do as much for other groups of disabled people when it comes to cognitive or neurological disabilities or invisible disabilities, so like mental health.
I will point out that the ADA was one of those, it's hard to believe right now, but it was a bipartisan bill. And in order to make it a bipartisan bill, it was much less around civil rights than it was about access and opportunity. So that's actually the strength of the ADA. And so when we think of the ADA, everybody immediately thinks about ramps, right? Ramps. But I was teaching a class on disability history last year. No, it must have been 2 years ago, pre-COVID. And my students were commenting that the building we were in had a ramp, right? A really nice, beautiful ramp, beautifully designed so that you could access the room that we were in. But as they pointed out, Yale doesn't really accept that many people with at least physical disabilities. And so, for example, Yale College in the past maybe 6 years that I can think of has maybe had one person who was a wheelchair user per 2 or 3 years, right? And you could always tell that was the wheelchair person, right? Very tokeny. And so it's all very well to have fantastic universities with ramps everywhere and buildings that are accessible almost everywhere. We also have an accessibility committee that travels around the university regularly assessing buildings for accessibility, but who's accessing them? Or and I thought that was a really interesting problem, that we see the ramp, but we don't necessarily see the structural issues that go towards why it is there isn't anyone using the ramp other than able-bodied students walking up the ramp. So I wanted to ask a little bit about some changes in disability history. So we all are here involved in very recent work in disability history, but I think that we're all also aware of how that kind of history has changed and its relationship to other kinds of scholarship. And so are there sources or theoretical frameworks? What is it that we value today that might not have been true 30, 40 years ago, acknowledging, first of all, that 30, 40 years ago, there was not much history that explicitly thought of itself as disability history. So, Rabia, I'll turn that complicated question over to you first.
I feel in some ways this is karmic justice for being a law professor and using the Socratic method sort of on my students. So I think that there is more of a sense of, I think as both Kim and Beth have noted, thinking intersectionally. Borrowing pages from how we have thought about other social movements and then thinking about the chronicle of, say, the disability rights movement, thinking about the ADA generation, thinking about, say, Vietnam vets, World War II vets, things like that. There's also, I think, sort of a growing sense, at least sort of in the legal history area of sort of implementation issues. So how things like the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA have been implemented. But one thing I was thinking about, so Naomi, when you were mentioning in terms of the ADA being bipartisan, I don't know if I'm that surprised that it's bipartisan because it's not very redistributive. So one thing I was thinking in terms of like how, so going forward, say if we're thinking about issues of, say, political capitalism or this whole history of capitalism that's happening now, or thinking about welfare rights, or thinking about sort of these needs of redress, right? What types of claims making does disability have in terms of how resources should shift? And that is, I mean, it's a tough thing in terms of like thinking about sort of a group that is disempowered in general, in terms of like what type of history are we going to have and for what purposes. So I think an older school method has been sort of the agency and resistance and we are here sort of moves, right? We're going to show that people are here that were not there before, that we didn't think were there before, right? Hooray, right? So there's visibility. Or we're going to show that people resisted or they had agency because we presume that they didn't. Or we're going to show sort of these people that are really exceptional in a way that we didn't expect them to be either. But we don't want to do any of that now, certainly. I mean, I think that we're trying to think of new ways, right, to give people who are disempowered sort of ways to be in history than as opposed to just like heroic figures. Then I think that that's sort of the way that we've done, I think, too much in the past, right? And then also that they have to be a vehicle for broad revolutionary change, as opposed to people that are, folks living their lives, right? That are not necessarily part of a revolutionary vanguard. But that is really important to show too.
Yeah, no, definitely. Kim.
Boy, again, there's so much to talk about here. It's interesting. Well, of course, I hope at least historians always think about sources and ethics, but I think that disability history has really pushed us and continues to push us to think about the ethics of sources. And, because in too many cases, disabled people have appeared in historical sources that only had people write about them. They were only written about by the experts. And I just wrote a book on a woman who spent 20 years in an insane asylum in the 19th century and who never left behind anything in her own words or of her own records. So historians are really thinking about sources and who created them, what are the ethics behind them, how can we use them ethically? And to me, that's an exciting thing that's going on in disability history. It's not that we've solved everything. I think we're simply asking the questions.
Beth.
Yeah, that is true, Kim. The silenced too, or the silenced voices, and what do we do about that? And what do we do? I mean, that We know that this from AFAM studies. We know it from like, how do you read, you know, against the grain, or how do you get stories from people who might not have had a written record? And we know that the archives are pretty, you know, stacked towards the educated elite. I would say, though, the things that have changed, I mean, when I was coming on the scene as a wee one in disability history, it was like, you know, Kim was one of the people, and there were probably like 5 other scholars, you know, to turn to. That's a little, maybe 10. Um, and you know, those were the people, you know, to even do a list like we do for our PhDs, you know, it was difficult to do a disability list at the time that I got out, which was 2006. So, but I would say, so before that, we know that disability history, and I put that in quotes, was being written sort of, you know, by rehabilitation experts and by policy analysts. Like, you know, there was always some kind of, and then by the people, like, so the different interest groups. So blind, you know, like you can find really good archives about these specific interest groups that wrote their own history. So it's kind of, and then I think also, I think the other thing that's slowly changing, thanks to people like Kim, and I'm thinking of the OAH Perspectives magazine that was like, I don't remember what year that was. I know Dan Wilson did that. But how do we educate before even college? How do we educate in elementary school and in high schools? You know, I'm still at the point, I can't wait, I guess, when I get college students, I can't wait for the day when they don't say to me, I've never studied disability history. And so again, I think that that is a real issue, that, speaking back to Rabia, like, you know, maybe some kind of protest has to happen. I'm not really sure, but it is mysterious to me. And I think, as I've taught disability history over the last 15 years to undergraduates, I see more and more people self-identifying. I see more and more people wanting to know about their history, and feeling a little bit angry that it was not brought up before this point in their education, that it was kind of just glossed over.
That's a very interesting point. I teach disability history both to undergraduates and to graduate students, as I know you do too. And my graduate students, in no way do I suggest at any part of my teaching that you need to be self-identified as a person with a disability to study disability history. But at least the last time that I taught that course, over the semester, each person in the room, not all at once, but over a period of time, as it were, came out. Either they were a person with a disability, or they had a brother, sister, mother, whatever, with a disability that had brought them to this class. And they said this because they wanted this to be understood by the rest of the students in the room. So there is a kind of interesting identity politics that is suggesting at the moment that disability history is appealing to those people who feel they have an extra incentive to do this, rather than just being a kind of cool other course like the history of Vietnam or whatever, which of course should have a significant disability history part of it, Rabia, just to say naturally. So we have a question that I want to articulate, which is when we talk about disability, the different ways that it was defined, physical, intellectual, emotional, the question is asking, can you tell us about neurodiversity, and whether the kinds of things we would call neurodiversity today are seen historically or being investigated historically. So who would like to begin that one? Kim, I saw your hand. So you can jump on what you were going to say.
But actually, why don't I address your question, and then maybe I could go back to a little bit on education. To me, one of the really hard but really exciting things about disability history is that we're doing the histories of identities and diagnoses that did not exist in other time periods, right? Of course, there's always been cognitive, mental, bodily diversity of human beings, right? And in ways of being and ways of moving through the world and ways of communicating. That's always been the case. But how those are categorized as medical or spiritual or diagnostically changes over time. So, we talk about autism or neurodiversity today, but those things, I can't use those keywords in the 1670s or the 1830s. And so that is a challenge, but also I think a joy of disability history, because there's huge historical change. You see it. So that's not a great answer, but it's always there.
What were you going to say?
Okay. Well, what I was going to say, I was really struck by Naomi's comment about education in various ways and the ways that we pulled up with that. I think one of the things that I struggle with historically and contemporarily is the ways that disability and poverty work together, and poverty creates disability, and lack of healthcare, living with pollution, poor healthcare, poor education contributes to and exacerbates disability. And I think the reality is that the less elite an academic institution, the higher the rate of students with disabilities at those places of higher ed. And we know that students with disabilities, regardless of disability, have lower rates of higher education in general, and they often are discouraged from higher education. So I particularly think it's important for us to think about who's present, but also who's not, and why they're not present, and why a larger percentage of students with disabilities are at institutions that are not as elite. And note, I'm not saying not as good, I'm saying not as elite.
And then also, I think that in terms of academic politics and culture, like elite politics and culture in general, is like there is a strong push to transcend what your body is doing, so that you are supposed to move past any type of pain or need for sleep or any other types of things, which does not really lend itself to a conversation that's going to really include disability, except as the boogeyman, right? So.
Yeah, and I wanted to jump on what Kim was saying too. Like, yes, we can talk about disability, and disability as a category to be defined as disabled in certain contexts is an entitlement, right? So it's even, how do you even capture the people who don't even have the resources to get the categorized in that way in order to get entitlements that they deserve. So I find that also a really interesting thing to think about when we talk about who we're not talking about and who's not there.
Yeah, those are really important issues. I'm always struck that we have an Office of Disability and Accessibility, and it gets really, really busy the week before exams. Why? Because many students, usually white privileged students, go to that office and say, I need extra time on my exam because I have, and then they fill in the whatever it is kind of disability, right? They're at the Office of Disability, arguing that that's why they need that extra time. And what often strikes me about that is that there are many other people at Yale, other students of Yale, first gen at Yale, students of color at Yale, and they don't usually go to the Office of Accessibility, right? They don't ask for extra time. They don't come up with that kind of diagnosis. There's very clear sorts of, you might even say elite or white notions of certain kinds of acceptable disability. So we have another question, and I'm going to answer this first before I ask the panelists, which is, if we could recommend one book on the history of disability, what would it be? I think we all knew that this was going to come. But I want to jump in first and say that Kim Nielsen has a spectacular book on the history of disability. It is just amazing. And I really want to mention that. And even though we were asked for only one, I want to also suggest an incredible memoir that I read also as a history by Simi Linton called My Body Politics, which raises, among many other questions, which we haven't talked about yet today, the question of sexuality and disability. And it's really in dealing with the fact that she experienced as a woman, a young woman with a disability, that how uncomfortable all of her therapists were at ever talking about sex, that actually moved her into activism itself. But I will go around the panel and ask them for maybe one additional.
Well, okay, so I was going to say Kim too. That's where I usually send people, is to do Kim's Disability History of the United States, which is fantastic. I also, I know, just to push back, I guess, a little bit on the question, sorry, is that there is the danger of the single story, right? Though, as people like Stelling Young have told us about, right? Especially, I think, when it comes to disability, there have been people like a person put on a pedestal, which then gets disaggregated from other things. So I would really say, you can start with Kim, but keep going. And then also, it's been really useful for me to see the folks who are our cousins, the people that have been doing the strong work and thinking about race, thinking about sexuality. So, go and look at Gay New York, go and look at Martha Jones's Vanguard, go and look at Taya Miles's work. They're going to offer us things that can be really useful in disability as well.
Kim?
Throw a book in. Yes, I'd love to throw a book in. Jennifer Barclay has a great new book, and it's called The Mark of Slavery, Disability, Race, and Gender in Antebellum America. I think that is a fantastic example of the great scholarships that's coming out just this year.
And Beth?
Yeah, so University of Illinois, right, Kim? I mean, that's the place to go. The series that Kim and Mike Rembus are editors of, if people want to dive into disability history, that is the first place to go. Kim's book, well, any of her books, but the one that's an introductory by Beacon Press is a really good, and that's what I meant before when, the benefit of Kim's book is that could be taught in high schools. And that's where the intervention could happen. And writing history of disability even 10 to 15 years ago was difficult because there wasn't really a grand narrative. To go back to Rabia, it's hard to write history when you don't even have what is a synthetic story, and then let me diverge from it, or let me go deeper, or what do I do? And so Kim did that for us, did that for the field. So, but also her work on Helen Keller and so forth. But I would say, and then other works, University of Illinois Press, their disability history series, some really fantastic new work looking at the intersection of race and disability. And then as far as memoirs, I'm really enjoying Gollum Girl by Riva Lehrer. It has to do more with my research interest, but also I just like her voice and her as an artist.
I actually want to jump in and say a word about the University of Illinois. So it's not a coincidence that the University of Illinois has such a strong disability history series and a commitment to disability studies. The University of Illinois ended up being a place that Warm Springs polio survivors, after they had been treated there for a while, were sent to do college work. Now, I don't know why it was the University of Illinois. Of course, you could go other places as well, but the University of Illinois ended up with like a little core of people with physical disabilities, especially polio, but others as well. And they became an activist corps at the University of Illinois. And they began to argue that it's not just that they needed ramps. Some ramps had already been built for World War II veterans. And then other disabled people went to the University of Illinois because they had ramps. You see what I mean? And then the university began slowly to hire people who were in disability studies, who could then teach courses to education students or other kinds of students that raise questions of disability. And really now the University of Illinois is a really top ranked place for studying disability. That sort of comes from that that kind of moment right after the Second World War. So we have another question. This is a hard one, everybody. Somebody's writing that this is National Disability Employment Month, but individuals with disability have the highest unemployment rate. How do we make laws that change that and change the stigma? All right, let's begin with our legal expert.
Well, I guess that goes back to that issue of redistribution that I mentioned before. So people have mentioned this, for example, Sam Bagenstas, who is a disability law professor is now, I think he's been confirmed. Sorry, Sam, I don't remember if you have been. I know you were nominated in terms of being at the Department of Health and Human Services. Sort of talked about, for instance, that so if you have someone who is disabled, sort of once they get to the job, right, then there can be, say, accommodations, but we have not given resources for people before that happens. So I think that there needs to be then sort of like, I mean, for a lot of different reasons, right, massive rethinking of how we think about sort of care and welfare within the United States. We're talking about that in other guises having to do with COVID, for example, in terms of the fact that we don't have a strong social welfare fabric. So then it just falls on, say, women, for example, to take care of, children, sort of folks who are vulnerable, because we have not given any type of really investment in those directions. So that's a lot of it in terms of it's not just about in terms of an anti-discrimination ethos sort of on the job, but then also thinking about what are the types of services that we need in order for people to be able to access and get the jobs sort of in the first place.
Just to add to that too, it was the result of disability rights activists that changed some of the Social Security requirements, which is that if you made a certain amount of money, you could no longer be covered by Social Security disability insurance, which then meant you couldn't afford to have an attendant or sometimes even afford the equipment that you needed. And so it was a really vicious circle, right? Even if you got a job, that was suddenly seen as a reason to deny you the supports that you had before.
Right. I mean, we still generally have this idea, right? Like that you are supposed to have this job, right? And that is supposed to provide you all of the benefits and resources that you need. And if you don't have one, then there's something wrong with you. And if there, quote unquote, is something wrong with you, because you're supposed to be exceptional to this American way of life, then we're going to have all of these hoops that you have to jump through in order to prove that. So all of that needs to be taken down with a sledgehammer. And it sort of has to in order for us to get broad change.
Can I just add to that? And maybe this is going to get pushback from the audience here, but I worry that something like this, the Paralympics and the Special Olympics, also reinforce that notion of specialness and the celebrity disabled person who's a great athlete, right? And they're a great athlete, they just managed to overcome it all, right? And there they are with a medal around their neck. And it's very hard not to see that and think, see, why can't you do that? This person did it. So just to throw that out there. Beth, did you want to anything to? No.
If I can say something, I think one way we can work on this very, very important employment issue is by voting. We need to vote. And, you know, in my community, we need better public transportation. And I need to vote at the local level. And I need to, because people with, right, we all need to get to work. If you can't get to work, you can't have the job. So we need to vote at the national level, at the state level, at the local level, and think about transportation, education, healthcare access, safety, all those kinds of things.
One last question. This is our last question before we have to finish up. This is a question about where the study of disability should take place in the academy, or how we should think about it. And one of the proposals that you hear about, and I hear about it from my university as well, is the idea of medical humanities. The disability should sort of be subsumed in a kind of multidisciplinary minor, maybe, or a certificate or something like that. And the idea of medical humanities as a major, minor, and so to attract students interested in healthcare and administration, perhaps, maybe also medicine, nursing, and so on. But the question is, how do we feel about that? Is there something, is there a disconnect between putting disability studies in a medical named field? So I just sort of throw this out as our final question. Let's begin with Beth. Beth, what do you think?
I think that it's problematic to house it in a healthcare center or in the medical school, because it is assumed in those places, if it's not a cure model, it's at least a rehab model, which is basically a soft cure model, I guess. Unless the rehab model is equally directed by the person seeking rehab and the rehab technician, then I think it can be a powerful combination and can be helpful. But that is not to say, so I guess in my ideal world, there would be a disability studies center freestanding. I know that's like, you guys all know that that's kind of fictive, but a freestanding disability studies program that doesn't belong to the history department or to the English department or to any other said department, but that also does have important crossover with medicine and nursing, if those schools exist there, and maybe allied health, and also with student with disability services. I feel like, and on top of it, if we're talking about pipe dreams, I want it to be a place also that could have some sort of where faculty could go. Like, we have student with disability services, but we don't have faculty with disability services. And I think this is more problem. I mean, Hirschbaum has written about this, about disability, and Margaret Price about disability in the academy and how hard it is. And it's worse at private institutions than at public, but I don't think any of them are particularly good. So I guess my pipe dream is, never going to happen too soon, but maybe if we get the right, kind of protest going, maybe. But it would be a self-standing, and it would be interdisciplinary, I think, ideally, and would be a place where people could talk about disability and come at it like anthropologically, political science, English, history, and then also have a tie with the people who are in the medical establishment who treat people with disabilities, because we don't want to push them out either, right? Like, we want them to be part of the conversation, and then also, of course, people with disabilities there, right? Like, also them to have some kind of role to play in this center.
I am going to arbitrarily say that that's the last thing that you're going to hear from our panel. I'm delighted to think about the wonderful model of a strong disability center that not beholden to anybody, but responsive to stakeholders who should be there. So Gavin, let me just turn it over to you briefly.
I just want to say thank you all for a really fascinating conversation. Also, thank you to Elizabeth, our ASL interpreter, who's been doing a heroic job. And I want to let everyone watching know that we will have this up on our YouTube channel in about a week. We also got many more questions than we possibly could answer, but we will pass all of those on to all the panelists. I just want to thank our partners. So these are the different institutions who have been co-sponsors with us. And then finally, if you would like to learn more about this series, you can visit masshist.org/disability, and you should be able to find all the information there. So thank you all, and have a great evening.